So, for the last sort of couple of months, we've been really talking about ideas around sort of what happens when people get to Canada and how Canadian dynamics are shaped by that. This week, we're going to talk about sort of two things. One of them is the process by which people come to Canada. So, we're going to do a little bit of discussion about immigration policy and that kind of thing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the experiences of racism in Canada, which are unfortunately still very, very real, but it's an important part to understand. And the two things are connected in a number of ways. The first of which is to really about really sort of the idea of early immigration policy. So early on in Canada's history, sort of even before Confederation, but certainly after Confederation, through about the mid 1960s, actually, there was an idea that the best possible immigrants would to Canada would be those who could fit in and sort of benefit the country economically. We still look for these sorts of things in immigrants who are applying to come to Canada, but what we mean by those criteria has been a little bit different. So what this sort of meant historically and in sort of early Canadian history is this idea that those people who could fit in would be the most ethnically and culturally like the sort of Brits who controlled in a lot of ways the political system of Canada. So this meant that the earliest preference and sort of the people that Canada was most excited to sort of receive and sort of accept was British Protestants, certainly, and Americans. Americans were also sort of considered to fit in, and were able to sort of handle the cold, handle the sort of political environment, not the political environment, but handle sort of the agricultural work. They were suited to that sort of work and sort of prepared for that. Then we sort of wound up with sort of preferences beyond that. So you would have, for example, a preference for Europeans, which initially just meant, oh, Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales. And then was sort of expanded to talk about, okay, well, we can talk about France and we can talk about Italy. Um, and then there was sort of a preference for Central Europe. So this is where we sort of get into Germany, into that sort of space in terms of the Ukraine, in terms of the Balkans, and then Eastern Europeans. So this is sort of Russia and that kind of thing. Then the preference was for people coming from Asian countries, and very last was sort of populations coming from Africa. And what this looked like prior to 1967, we'll talk about 1967 in a little bit, but prior to 1967, what that wound up looking like was that there was honest to goodness a list. So the government of Canada would make a list about which their preferred countries were, so their favorite countries for immigrants to come to Canada. And if they were going to admit 100,000 immigrants total in that year, and 99,000 applied to come from the first country on the list, all 99,000 of them would get in, and then they would go to country 2 and look for the remaining 1,000. And if you didn't have, and if we just didn't get to your country, you just didn't get to immigrate to Canada. Which, if you sort of think about where that order goes, so the British Isles, Americans, Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, then Africa, one of the things that you recognize very, very quickly is that it becomes quite difficult for a lot of visible minorities of any description, really, to immigrate to Canada for a long time. And this was sort of because of that image and that desire to create a white British Protestant country. And there was an idea at the time that the only way to create sort of a stable and manageable country was to do so with a homogenous population. So they were trying really, really, really hard to make sure that everyone was the same. We don't do that anymore, but there are some consequences of that sort of pattern. So if you sort of remember when we talked a little bit about the settlement of the Métis, they move west, right? So they first settle in sort of parts of Ontario, and then they sort of move west to the Red River and sort of the Northwest settlements in that area, And then by 1890 and sort of past that, they're moving out even further west in order to preserve their way of life. That sort of pattern tells you a little bit of the story of where immigrants settled in Canada based on sort of when the wells ran dry, I guess, of immigrants from more preferred countries. So one of the things that you will find is that in places like, for example, Ontario, you have many more Canadians who trace their ancestry to families that immigrated from Britain to Canada. Okay, there are very few of those families in Alberta, and that's basically because you sort of land in Montreal and you take up all of the available farmland that's near that, and then you go to the next ring out, and you go to the next ring out. And what that sort of means is that you create very, very, very different patterns of immigration to different places in the country. So, for example, I'm teaching this in Alberta, and many of my students will have lived in Alberta, so I imagine that most of you have eaten pierogi and don't think anything of it. But there are definitely places in the country where that is understood as an ethnic food rather than as something that people just sort of, you can go on Jasper and buy it at a restaurant, and it's not sort of treated as only Ukrainians eat there. And one of the reasons for that is that Alberta, just based on when it was settled and when it sort of was open for settlement and when that was sort of available, has a relatively large population of Ukrainians that live here or that settled here. And there's such a large number of them that in a lot of ways it has influenced Alberta's food culture, in that pierogi is very common. You can talk about kielbasa, you can talk about all kinds of things that sort of shift in that way. And that creates a very different experience, for example, of pierogi in Alberta versus pierogi in, for example, PEI. There's just not the same kind of conversation around that. There's not the same kind of groups of people who settled there. So what you sort of wind up with is like stripes on maps of like where people settled. So, for example, when we talk about immigration from Iceland, there's like a significant chunk of them that all wound up in southern Manitoba. And some of that is a preference piece. And so when we start talking about Ukrainians all wound up in Vegreville and sort of places like that in Alberta, there's a tendency for some of my students to sort of treat that as though it is discriminatory, as though sort of we created ghettos where you could only settle in these towns. And that, for the most part, we will talk about head taxes and Japanese internment in our next video, but for the most part, that's not really what happens. What happens is that you and 15 people from your small village are all going to settle in Canada, and you'd really like to stay in touch with each other, because especially early on in Canada's history, and even up until sort of the 1970s, it's really hard to move, because when you do that, you're essentially cutting off any kind of meaningful day-to-day contact with your family, with the people that you knew beforehand, with the people who understand your traditions, who've known you your whole life, all of those sorts of things. And as human beings, one of the things that gives us security and makes us feel sort of comfortable in our living space and sort of gives us that kind of anchor is that kind of connection. So if 15 people are all leaving from your small little village and they're bringing their wives and children, it makes a lot of sense to put all of those families together, because it gives them some of that sort of community sense. And as well, if you're immigrating to what the Canadian government has been trying to build as an Anglophone Protestant British country for a very long time, and you would still like to, for example, be able to maintain your religious traditions, it makes sense for you to settle near other families that have similar cultural and religious traditions to you, because it allows you to do things like build churches and religious institutions. So, for example, just so you guys know, the first mosque in Canada was actually built in Edmonton as a sort of result of this kind of pattern of immigration. It also means that when your children get of an age to decide to get married, they can do things like marry people who have similar cultural backgrounds to you, if that's important to you. So there's a lot of reasons for that kind of settlement. I am going to say, though, that although we talk about, we don't have these preferences anymore, we still have a lot of preferences in conversations around immigration. It is not a lottery system, it's not random. It's just that a lot of our preferences now are much more economic. And so the preference is for immigrants who are going to contribute economically to Canada's economy, to Canada's tax base, all of those sorts of things. So there are a lot of questions about that. So, and I sort of want to get into a couple of them very briefly. We'll get into them a little bit later. But one of the things that this means is that in a contemporary context, if you have post-secondary education, if you went to university, you are much more likely to be able to immigrate to Canada than if you don't. So if you trained as a nurse, if you trained as a teacher, if you trained as an engineer, it's way easier for you to immigrate to Canada. Okay? And Canada makes that decision because they've decided that engineers make a larger contribution to the Canadian tax base than, for example, unskilled laborers, which is probably objectively true. However, it does raise a lot of questions about what's happening to the countries that are sending immigrants, because even in Canada, access to post-secondary education is often limited to the most privileged people in society. So the people who have the most cultural capital, the people who have access to the most money, the people whose parents have educations. And that is doubly so in many of the countries that are sending the majority of the immigrants arriving in Canada today. So this is conversations about India, this is conversations about many countries in Africa, all of those kinds of conversations, they're doing the same thing. The people who have access to post-secondary education are likely to be already the most privileged people in society. And there's an argument that when Canada says, oh, we will take your engineers and your nurses and your doctors and your lawyers, but we won't take your unskilled immigrants, that one of the things that's happening is that Canada is making those countries stay poor and stay sort of in really challenging situations. Not just Canada, but like every Western country that accepts immigrants is doing that because what they're doing is they're pulling out the people who would be best able to improve that situation. In that Canada's taking trained teachers and trained nurses and trained doctors, which means that the countries that sort of those immigrants come from are now without doctors and nurses and teachers. So that's a conversation that we call about brain drain, and that it sort of causes problems in sort of sending countries. And it's definitely difficult to balance that with individual freedom and individual liberty, and those people want to come to Canada or want to immigrate elsewhere. But there's sort of a challenge around that. There's also a challenge around whether or not our economic preferences have just become a gloss that we paint over racial preferences, and that really it's not that different. And this becomes part of the conversation when we start looking at which types of education are most likely to be accessible and which types of education, for example, are privileged in our immigration system. So if you look, for example, at a place like South Africa, one of the big things you'll sort of notice very quickly is that the people who are more likely to have access to post-secondary education are white, despite the fact that almost 90% of the population of South Africa is non-white. And that is sort of true across the board because white populations in former colonies and former colonial states tend to be more privileged. So there's this conversation about hiding racialized preferences there. There's also conversations about the supposed quality of educational institutions. So, for example, if you graduated from a university in Germany, you are much more likely to be able to practice whatever profession you earned easily in Canada than if you graduated from a university with the same sort of degree coming out of Nigeria. And that is sort of a challenge in that kind of conversation. And so I just sort of I want you to think about this. And one of the reasons that I sort of make this its own video is that it's one of the challenges in your textbook. Your textbook talks about Canada as being constructed by the French, the English, and the Indigenous populations. But there are way more cultural groups that have immigrated to Canada and that shape the reality of Canada, but they don't necessarily shape how we talk about Canada. in terms of how we include people in those sorts of environments. So I wanted to sort of give a brief introduction of this, and now we're going to talk about some aberrations, I guess.